Good afternoon, everybody. We'll wait a couple minutes to see who else logs on. Okie dokie. As people sign on, I just wanted to take this opportunity to remind you that your questions for your interviewee are due today, just so I can give you some feedback and hopefully suggest some things you might not have thought of before you go to your interview. So I'll try to get those back to y'all on Sunday, so you'll have plenty of time to do the interview before the papers due in 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. Again, remember that I did update the syllabus. The updated version is on Blackboard. I took down the old version. So if you printed it out, make sure that you print out the new version. Really, you only need to print out the last page because all I did was change the calendar. So, alrighty, so today what we're going to do is sort of back up what we talked about and watch videos about on Tuesday. And I'm going to do lecture, but sort of brief lecture to look at some of the stats and other issues related to eyewitness testimony and the psychological research related to that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, and I'll get chat out in case you all want to ask any questions there. Okay. So just some quick stats about eyewitness testimony. Approximately 75,000 defendants are implicated by eyewitnesses in the US every year. But unfortunately, some do make mistakes. 75% of the first 218 people exonerated on the basis of DNA analysis had been mistakenly identified by an eyewitness. And 88% of 121 exonerated prisoners wrongly sentenced for rape between 1989 and 2003 were victims of faulty eyewitness testimony. And again, could very easily be situations like we saw the other day where there are huge racial implications, and there are other sort of like tricks your mind plays on you. And if the lineup is not shown to you with the assumption that the person might not be there, right? That's another piece of it. So what comes into play here psychologically? So if any of you have taken sensation of perception or cognition with Dr. Ariel, a lot of this will be familiar to you. So this is just a thumbnail sketch of stuff that actually is covered in 2 different classes in our curriculum. So I want to just put that out there, just so you know. So to process information about a crime, we first perceive a stimulus and then retain it in our minds at least momentarily. But failures and errors can emerge at any step along the way. So perception is essentially how we interpret sensory information once it makes it to our brain. So perception is how we make meaning of sound waves or the light that turns into visual information. So certain variables can really affect how well we interpret that information. So for example, the weapon focus effect is one of these. If a weapon is present when a crime is committed, we may devote more attention to it than to the facial features or other physical aspects of the person who has the weapon. If someone has a gun aimed at you, you're probably going to be looking at the gun and not the person's face, right? And that's what happens here, and that, of course, can lead to you not only not remembering information about the person, but just sort of never processing it in the first place. So there are different stages of memory, and the first is encoding. So encoding is where we take, again, this outside information and we try to translate it to the storage part of our memory. Now, there is a lot of information we take in, really honestly, at any given second. All right, so if I were just thinking about all the things I can process right now, right? It'd be like, I can see out my window, you know, there's a lamp here, my ring light, oh, do I have my camera positioned the right way? I can see some of you, and, you know, I'm always sort of watching the chat box, and, you know, where's Simbo? He's downstairs, right? And my shirt is kind of looking like a trippy magic eye thing on camera. But my brain lets me just focus on what I need to, which is what I'm saying, right? So there's a lot of information we take in every second that we just let go because we can't contain it all. We can't store it all. And certainly in cases of extreme stress, we can encode the information incompletely or inaccurately. And the characteristics of the witness can also come into play here. So things like visual acuity and hearing ability, right? So if I was someone who wore bifocals and hearing aids, right? And I didn't have either of them on me and I'm trying to testify, they're probably going to discredit me pretty quickly. Storage is where we literally put it into, you know, there's not a physical spot per se, but our memory banks, right? And so memory fades as the retention interval increases because essentially our mind just sort of figures, I need to make room for new stuff. Maybe this stuff isn't that important because we haven't had to think about it in a while. Post-event information can also alter your memory of the event. Right, so if you've talked through something multiple times, or you see something on the news about a crime that you were an eyewitness to, then all of a sudden, you might start taking in what other people say. And I mean, like, oh yeah, I do remember that, rather than what you actually witnessed. Viewing photos of suspects after witnessing a crime can also impair an eyewitness's ability to recognize the perpetrator's face in the lineup. So, you know, again, if this person's on TV, or someone they think is the suspect is on TV, or they just show you a bunch of photos of someone, but then they do an in-person lineup, right? That can interfere, like the videos we watched on Tuesday. One of the most important parts of memory that we often forget to talk about is retrieval, right? I can do the best encoding in the world. I can store it perfectly, but now I got to get it out of there, right? And I got to get it out of there accurately. So the wording of questions can influence retrieval. So for example, if you just ask, you know, what did you see? That's really different than what was the man with the mustache doing with the young boy, right? It's very leading, implies things along those lines, and might make you misremember things. You can also lead them with simple things like, was the man's shirt blue? Instead of just saying, what color was the man's shirt? Unconscious transference can also happen, where victims may pick from a lineup someone they've seen before, but who's not actually the criminal. So maybe this is someone they see wait on them at their favorite restaurant, or again, they saw on TV for another crime, right? So they're familiar. So in their mind, they're like, oh, that must mean this is the guy, right? But in fact, it might not be. All right, so common research methods for how we study things related to eyewitness testimony. So the first is experimental methodology. So with this, the researcher is going to manipulate some variable like the presence or absence of an instruction to the participants who are serving as witnesses, and measures the effects, like the likelihood of choosing someone from the lineup. So I could, randomly assign people to watch a video, and then afterwards I could tell half of them, here's a lineup, the person that did the crime is in this lineup, and the other half I could just be like, here's some pictures, is any of this the person? The advantage of an experiment is it's really good for establishing cause and effect relationships. But the disadvantage is that it lacks ecological validity. So when you go in to do an experiment, and those of you who are psych majors or have taken other psych classes may have done this, right? With either a professor or one of our Psych 480 students, where you go in and you're taking an experiment. And it's like you're doing this to get some class credit or extra credit. And so there's not really any kind of pressure on you. Usually the student tries to put you at ease, right? That's really different than if in the moment you witnessed a crime, right? You're in a totally different mindset. So the processes that they're suggesting seem to be may operate totally differently when you're under a state of mental stress. And obviously, we can only do so much ethically to reproduce that. You can also do what's called archival analysis. And this involves after the fact examination of actual cases involving eyewitnesses. So like examining the choices that the eyewitness made from the lineup. An advantage is that it does use real life situations, but a disadvantage is that it can only document what happened in those particular cases. And unless you also get permission to go and find the people who were interviewed and get more information from them, you can't explain why. Why did you choose that person, right? We don't know. So there are many variables, unfortunately, that can influence the accuracy of eyewitness memory. And to be honest, this is true of memory in general. But again, we're going to specifically talk about eyewitness memory here. So Wells in 1978 created a taxonomy to categorize variables that could affect eyewitness accuracy. So a system variable are factors under the control of the criminal justice system. So this would be things like you saw in the video where the detective said, now we would tell her the guy might not be in here, right? Or doing things like presenting photos one at a time instead of all together. An estimator variable are factors beyond the control of the justice system and whose impact on reliability of the eyewitness can only be estimated. So this could include things like the lighting conditions at the time of the crime. This can include things like the other race effect, which we talked about in passing on Tuesday. So eyewitnesses are usually better at recognizing and identifying members of their own race or ethnic group than they are members of another race or ethnic group. And so in terms of why does this occur? One is physiognomic variability. These are our cognitive interpretations This is, again, we were talking on Tuesday how some people will be like, well, everyone who's X race all looks the same, which we know isn't true, right? But it's bias basically coming through, right? And then in-group and out-group differences are social interpretations, right? So, oh, they are different than me in this way, right? It's, again, a different type of bias. Gender of the eyewitness is something they've also looked at. There's no clear evidence that one gender is superior to the other in identifying people from lineups. In terms of age, older eyewitnesses and young children make more errors than younger and middle-aged adults. So they're more likely to choose someone from a lineup when the culprit isn't there, for example. But certainly, obviously, right? Anyone can make those mistakes. Post-diction variables don't directly affect the reliability of the identification, but it is a measurement of some process that correlates with reliability. So, for example, the confidence that a witness feels for identification. So Loftus talked about this in her research, right? The fact that, like, if you felt confident about your decision, if someone told you you chose the right guy, right, you're much less likely to change your mind or say, like, ooh, I might not be right. So all these things, reinforcement, the feedback we give, etc., are all going to affect the accuracy. So how do we try to control this, right? At least the parts we can control. So system variables in particular, those ones that are part of the justice system, are factors in an identification over which the justice system has some control. They tend to come into play after the crime and usually during the investigation. So information we find out post-event, the way that we question witnesses. So we try to make those procedures as unbiased as possible to at least rid of these potential systematic variables impacting eyewitness accuracy. So psychologists have learned about the following 5 system variables. So the first is interviewing eyewitnesses. So in a standard police interview, you basically rely on a predetermined set of questions with little opportunity for follow-up. Psychologists, however, have created the cognitive interview to help police gather information. So this was developed by Ronald Fisher and R. Edward Geiselman. And in a cognitive interview, the interviewer first is going to develop rapport with the witness, get the witness comfortable, establish them as someone who cares and wants to get information from the witness. Then you ask the witness to provide a narrative account of the event, the whole event, as they witnessed it. And then you probe for details with more specific questions. So it relies on a set of cues for memory retrieval. The interviewer may ask the witness to form an image of the situation. So use what we call imaginal imagery. Try to, see it play like it's on TV in front of you. To recollect sights, sounds, smells, etc. To think about the physical conditions at the time. And also the emotional reactions experienced at the time. And each one of these things are known to relate to more accurate recall of memory and more detailed recall of memory. They'll also have witnesses try to reconstruct the crime from different perspectives. And you discourage them from guessing when they're uncertain. When they're like, I don't know, maybe it could be, you say, no, it's okay, you don't have to guess, right? When the witness has mentally reconstructed the event, the interviewer asks for a detailed narrative, and then again uses these follow-up questions to probe for specific information. And the questions are designed purposely to be neutral and non-leading. And witnesses are sometimes asked to recall events in different temporal orders. So describe the event from the end back to the beginning, from different perspectives or from the point of view of different people. And this process, the cognitive interview, has been shown to generate approximately 34% more detail than the traditional interview, so a third more detail. However, whenever we produce more detail, there's also the potential for producing more incorrect detail, so we have to be cautious. But more recent research shows it's better for obtaining useful information and also eliminating errors. So as we get more information, more research about this, it seems like not only does it give us more information, more detail, but it's also more accurate. So you want to try to use this process when you're interviewing an eyewitness. Then there's the instructions to eyewitnesses. So an investigator should instruct the witness that the offender may or may not be in the lineup, for example. And without this instruction, eyewitnesses may assume that their task is to pick someone, right? So they choose the person who looks most like the perpetrator, even if they don't actually look that much like the perpetrator. You also have to be careful when you select your fillers, the other people's whose pictures or who you're physically going to bring in for the lineup. When choosing those fillers, you want to find people who generally match the witness's description and ensure the suspect doesn't stand out, right? So if the witness said it was a 6 foot tall white guy, right? You don't want the rest of the people in the lineup to be like teeny people of different races, right? Like it just won't work. Or all women or something like that, right? So you try to get, however many people you're putting in the lineup, all to generally look like what they described. Lineup presentation method also matters. In a traditional lineup, the eyewitnesses would see the suspect and fillers simultaneously. So this is called a simultaneous presentation. So you'd lay out all the pictures, or you'd have everybody come in and stand on that, lined wall like you see in movies, right? An alternative procedure, and in that case, people use a relative judgment, right? They're like, okay, that guy looks the most like the guy, so maybe that's him, right? An alternative procedure is to show suspects and fillers sequentially, so one at a time. In a sequential presentation, the witness makes a decision about each lineup member before seeing the next one. So they're making an absolute judgment. This person is the person, yes or no, right? Or maybe, but it's not that guy, right? So it is more accurate in terms of each individual person they're considering. Sequential lineups result in fewer identification attempts. So the only problem with that is, yes, mistaken identifications are reduced, but it can also potentially reduce accurate identifications. So why are there more mistaken identities in the simultaneous lineup? Well, as long as the perpetrator is in the lineup, it works pretty well. But if the actual culprit isn't there, as we saw in the case of Ron Cotton and the other guy, right? The other guy wasn't in the lineup. Then you may still have the witness say, yeah, it's that guy, positive identification, because someone in the group will always look most like the culprit. In a sequential lineup, the eyewitness compares each member of the lineup in turn to their memory of the perpetrator. And on that basis, they decide whether any person in the lineup is the individual who committed the crime. And then the other thing that we're going to talk about, the influence of feedback, they also mentioned in that video that we watched on Tuesday, right? So it's best to have the lineup administered by someone who doesn't know who is the suspect, For those of you who have taken other psych classes, we talk about this being a double-blind research methodology. So technically, the witness doesn't know who's the actual person, right, until they identify them. And the person presenting it doesn't know. Now, someone would know, right? The detective on the case would know, you know, number 3 is the guy, at least the guy we think it is, right? But the person who's actually administering it wouldn't know. And that is to avoid the fact that people can unintentionally communicate, this is the guy, right? So like, again, even things you don't realize you're doing. One of the things we'll do soon when we're talking about detecting deception is watch an episode of the show Lie to Me. And it talks a lot about gestural slips, right? So let's say you're pointing to pictures and you're like, this person, this person, this person, right? And you might not even realize you're doing that, but you're sort of like, woo, red flag, gold star, this person, right? And we're pretty good as humans at picking up those social cues from each other. A lineup administrator's knowledge can affect the likelihood that an eyewitness will choose someone from the lineup, as well as the confidence the eyewitness attaches to that choice. Witness confidence is not actually a strong predictor of whether they made the correct identification. So asking witnesses to provide a statement of their degree of certainty before giving them any feedback can be an effective way to eliminate the problem of false confidence, or you can just not give them feedback. You can avoid confirming feedback. If the eyewitness does receive confirming feedback from their lineup administrator, good, that's the person that that we wanted you to identify. Then this increases their certainty and their initial identifications. And again, if you compare that to people who didn't see that, didn't get that feedback, then they are much less certain. All right, so I have a very quick video to show y'all. So let me pull that up real quick and do this so you can actually see me. I just have to. Thought the link was in the PowerPoint, but it doesn't look like it is. Oh, nope, there it is. Okay, good. All right, so I am going to pull this up and then I will share screen. So don't freak out about it right now because I obviously have to share it with sound for you to be able to see it. So you're going to watch a clip. It's very short. It's only 5 seconds. And then you're going to write down what you saw. Let me maximize this to give you as much detail as you can. And I'll do a new share. Okay. All right, here we go. So write down what you saw. Alrighty, and either in the chat or you can unmute yourself. What did you see?
I saw a gray and a black car, and the car coming from like, I don't know how to describe it like on Zoom, but like one car hit the other one. The one that was like turning hit the one that was going straight.
Yeah, but I also noticed that the one turning was supposed to yield to oncoming traffic. There was a yield sign in the corner.
Anything else people notice? Any other details? All right, I'm going to flip our share back to the video and show it one more time. And now that you have had a chance to process it, we'll see if you see anything different here. So let me make sure, yep, I have the right thing selected. All right. Right, so yeah, it's when you watch it again and again, maybe you start to get more details, but like you both just said, right, like it's unclear whether it was the turning car that caused it because it was supposed to yield, or did that other car just come out of nowhere, right? It's really hard to tell.
One thing I notice is we're behind this yield sign, right? But there's not the word yield on the sign. And I don't really pay attention to the back of signs often, but I know if there's no writing, 9 times out of 10, it's not facing you. And that's where the car came from.
That's a good
That
question.
is a very good point.
Yeah. And I'm not sure. I think this was from someplace in Europe, if that's the case over there too or not. But yeah, certainly in the US, typically the writing would be on the side facing us, right? Yeah, but all that's really hard to see in 5 seconds, right? And even if the car they were supposed to yield, looks like the car was already in the process of turning. Right. Yeah. So this is tricky. This is actually why where I grew up in Michigan, they have what they call no fault insurance. So if you're in a crash like this, your insurance will pay for any damage done to your car because they don't have to like waste time trying to figure out whose fault. Now, obviously, if you like hit a parked car or you rear end someone, that's really different. But obviously, most places don't have that, right? So then you have to try to like reconstruct this, find CCTV footage if it exists, and try to figure out whose fault was it, right? And that can be really, really tricky. So I think it's really important to remember that these things often happen really quickly, right? And then when that happens, you don't really have time to process anything. And then you might be asked to be an eyewitness and you're like trying to remember. And it's often not right after it happened, which I had you do right after it happened, right? So, you know, you might have other stuff that you've seen in the meantime. Maybe you've seen the drivers get out and start yelling at each other and you empathize more with one driver than the other, right? So that's a big piece of it too. So in terms of eyewitnesses in the courtroom itself, jurors do put a lot of weight on testimony from eyewitnesses, again, which they maybe shouldn't do, right? But they do. So in 1974, Loftus was already doing this research, and she gave subjects a description of an armed robbery that resulted in 2 deaths. 18% of those presented with only circumstantial evidence against the defendant would convict him. But 72% would convict him when an eyewitness's identification was there too. So people put a lot of emphasis on eyewitness testimony. Jurors are influenced by eyewitnesses because they seem unaware of what we've just been talking about, right? This is not in the popular vernacular. We just sort of think, well, that person saw it with their own eyes, so they must be right. So jurors have little awareness of estimated variables that interfere with accurate retention, like that weapon focus. Jurors don't know about eyewitnesses who couldn't identify a subject, right? You might have had multiple eyewitnesses, but you only brought the one to the court who said, yeah, that was the guy, right? And maybe if you put the other ones in front of the same lineup, they would have been like, that's not him. And jurors pay attention to factors, including the confidence with which an eyewitness testifies. And we've just talked about how that has nothing to do with how accurate they are, right? In fact, you can be very confident about an inaccurate answer. And that obviously may not help the jurors distinguish accurate from inaccurate testimony. So in terms of safeguards against mistaken identification, jurors could be informed about whether investigators followed Department of Justice guidelines for conducting the lineups. So the DOJ guidelines are a lot of the things we've been talking about. You know, the sequential, not simultaneous, not giving feedback, things along those lines. Allowing psychologists who are knowledgeable about research on perception and memory to testify to the juries. Judges could instruct juries about the potential weaknesses of eyewitness identifications and suggest how to interpret this testimony. And again, jury instructions are a big piece of this. So what effects do cautionary instructions have on jurors' beliefs? The Telfair instruction, which is one of these standardized instructions judges could give, reduced mock juror sensitivity to eyewitness evidence, probably because the instruction mentions only vague directives and gives little indication of how jurors should evaluate the evidence. An instruction that incorporated information likely to be delivered by an expert preserved juror sensitivity to the factors that influence eyewitness reliability. Unfortunately, even though it appears that instructions can be effective, most judges just don't give them at all. So they're reluctant to unduly influence the jurors, which again, could potentially be to the detriment. So this is why, especially in high profile cases, you'll typically see expert witnesses brought in to tell the jury this information. Right, so we watched this video about recovered memories on Tuesday. This is the one about the experiment in the mall, like you're lost in the mall. Oh yeah, I remember the guy in the flannel shirt. Like you were never actually lost in the mall, right? So emotionally forgetting is called repression. And in this case, forgotten events are thought to be so traumatizing that individuals bury them deeply in their unconscious. So they repress those memories. And there's a lot of evidence, especially when the event is traumatic, that your brain sort of does this to protect you, right, from re-experiencing that trauma. Some suggest that repression has never been proven to exist, and that the inability to remember traumatic effects can be explained by ordinary forgetting. A related unconscious process is dissociation, in which victims of abuse or other traumas are thought to escape the full impact of an experience by psychologically detaching themselves from it. And the extreme version of this is what we used to call multiple personality disorder, and we now call dissociative identity disorder. So when someone is abused repeatedly, their brain might try so hard to repress it that they essentially form another personality, an alternate personality that they call an alter sometimes. And so what about these recovered memories? Well, most of the reports of recovered memories involve claims of childhood sexual abuse, or CSA. The theory is that individuals suffered sexual or physical abuse as kids and then repressed or dissociated the memory as, again, a form of unconscious protection, and then eventually recovered their long-lost memories, perhaps with the help of a therapist or just something happened that reminded them of it. So when we hear the word triggered in sort of lay vernacular, it's really not accurate. Triggered means something very specific psychologically. It means like that triggered a memory of something like a trauma, right? Or it triggered someone who has something like an eating disorder to go binge and purge, something like that. So it means very specifically that it brought up a symptom. Okay, so it's not just like, I got mildly upset. Like it literally triggered your symptoms of what the mental disorder you experienced. So sometimes repressed memories are recovered only after a person participates in a psychotherapy that applies techniques like hypnosis, age regression, using sodium amytal, which is essentially a truth serum, guided visualization, or diary writing that helps clients remember. So many researchers and therapists can question the validity of these memories. So what do we do about potentially false memories in court? Well, accusations that arise from recovered memories sometimes result in litigation. The claims in these malpractice lawsuits, typically against the therapist, usually take the following form. Thoughts that the abuse never occurred, that therapists created and implanted false memories of abuse through their use of memory retrieval techniques, and that clients ultimately came to believe the false memories and accused the alleged abuser of the abuse. Now, have there been cases where this occurred? Possibly, right? Is every single person who remembers a childhood trauma lying and making it up? No. Sometimes they just never told anybody about it. So the story I often tell is, while I was on my residency, I had a client who I was treating her for PTSD, and the PTSD the triggering event, the traumatic event she came in to talk about was being sexually assaulted when she was 17. So part of what you do in trauma therapy is you have them write the story of their trauma, and then you talk about it together. And when she came in the next week, she started talking about a gang rape that happened to her when she was 13. And I stopped her and I said, wow, you didn't bring this up before. And she said, I've never told anyone about this before. Right. And so she was in her 40s. So, you know, does it mean because someone remembers years later it's false? No. Right. And I think that's really important to remember. All right, what about using children as witnesses? So sometimes children are witnesses to crimes themselves, right? Sometimes children are abused. And so most childhood sexual abuse cases are going to rest solely on the words of the victim. And children over the age of 6 can make reasonably reliable identifications from lineups, provided that the perpetrator is actually in the lineup, and the child had extended contact with the perpetrator. They're not as good with one-offs, but to be perfectly honest, adults aren't either, right? Children are generally less accurate than adults when making an identification from a lineup in which the suspect is absent. So they're much more likely to pick someone else to make false positive errors rather than being willing to say that person's not there. So in terms of possible solutions, you can allow kids to practice on target absent lineups. So like having the kids' parents be the lineup, right? And be like, oh, no, neither of them are it, right? And so showing them it's okay to say the person's not there. Instructions explicitly telling the child that it's okay not to choose anyone from the lineup are also really helpful. So with childhood sexual abuse in particular, there are concerns about whether children can be trusted to provide accurate details and disclose experiences of abuse. And I'm putting all this in quotes because, like, we're not going to trust the victim, but we trusted the perpetrator, right? To abuse them over and over. So good interviewers first ask a child to describe the events in his or her own words. They use open-ended questions and let the kid use terms that make sense to them. And then they follow open-ended questions with specific questions, but kids are less accurate with those. Many preschool children recall little, even if they just witnessed the event, either because they are shy or because they fail to understand what you're actually asking them. Older children provide more detail, provided they're not asked about something that was ambiguous or confusing to them. And repetition enhances memories for aspects of the incident that are held constant, but it can also impair the ability to recall details that vary with each occurrence. So it's very important that you, again, try to have the kid tell it in their own words. Try to use these open-ended questions. This is also why it's important to teach children things like proper terms for parts of their body, right? So instead of calling it a down there, right, or a wee-wee, that's your penis, that's your vulva, right? That's your vagina. So those are really important pieces. It also just helps them to be body positive, to be perfectly honest. So what happens if you give suggestive questions to a kiddo? Well, interviewers with preconceived notions about an event will ask kids questions that elicit responses that are consistent with their beliefs. So these show interviewer bias. And so questioning in this suggestive manner can elicit false reports. And again, this is true of adults sometimes too, but certainly more true of kiddos. Social influence can also play a role in these interviews. children who are interviewed by a highly supportive interviewer may be more resistant to suggestive questions because they don't feel like the interviewer is going to get mad at them if they give the wrong answer. So one of the questions that comes up, if you're going to have the child serve as a witness through interviewing, come to the courtroom and testify, right, is what effect does this have on the child to have to discuss things in court? So talking about victimization in a public setting may actually increase the trauma for many children, although for some children, it can offer a therapeutic experience. Research done on this has found that most negative effects were for those who were young when the case started, those who had to testify repeatedly, and those who opted not to testify. And then the perpetrator subsequently got a light sentence. So how do jurors look at child witnesses? Child witnesses are generally viewed as less credible than adult eyewitnesses, except in the case of childhood sexual abuse. Here, younger victims are viewed as more credible than adolescents or adults, probably because jurors suspect that younger children lack the sexual knowledge to fabricate such an allegation. And there's some, obviously, research evidence to back that up. So how can you try to protect kids who do have to testify? So there are courtroom procedural modifications that have been allowed by judges to protect children from the stress of testifying. And again, these aren't standard. It would sort of be up to each individual judge to help with this. So one thing they can do is to put a screen in front of the defendant so the child doesn't have to look at them while they're testifying. You can also have the child testify in closed circuit TV, so in another room in the same building. You can have an advocate familiarize the child with the courtroom. And so this is, I know some of you thought about doing the training for CASA. And this is what CASA volunteers do, is they're assigned a kid, and it might be a kid going through something as horrible as a CSA case, but it could also just be like a custody case. Not that those are not horrible in some cases, but right, the child hasn't necessarily experienced abuse. And they're the ones who explain everything to the child, help them understand everything that's going on, and they're with them through the entire case so that they have that consistency. Sometimes they will have a support person to sit with the child during testimony. But also, in some courts, they've tried having a support animal to sit with the child during testimony. So they'll have a therapy dog and have the dog just sit with the kid while it testifies, and children feel more confident then. They can look at the dog instead of having to look anywhere else. And that ends up being much more comfortable for them. Alrighty, so I actually got through all of our material fairly quickly today, which is good. So I'm going to let you all go a little early, but I'll stick around in case anyone does have questions about anything. Have a good weekend. Take good care of yourselves. And I will see you all Tuesday if I don't see you before that.